Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Laura Macon-Isherwood, and in this bulletin we'll be bringing you a roundup of the latest stories developing around the world. But first, here's the headlines. Ukrainian President Zelensky says that Western military and diplomatic support has reached its highest level since the year Crimea was annexed, as fears swirl over a potential Russian invasion. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson heads to Ukraine to hold talks with President Zelensky, but misses a call with Russian President Putin as he fights for premiership after the Sue Gray report. Top Russian and US diplomats are set to speak again amid intense efforts by NATO allies to prevent an invasion of Ukraine and show support for Kyiv. Marking 1 year since the military seized power in Myanmar and plunged the country into chaos, the United States, Britain and Canada imposed sanctions against several top officials in the country. India unveils a budget of $529.7 billion for the coming fiscal year, stepping up investment on highways and affordable housing to put growth on a firmer footing as the economy recovers from the pandemic. Food inflation in crisis hit Sri Lanka hits a record 25% in January, with crop failures and difficulties in financing imports leading to widespread shortages. Battling the biggest crisis of his premiership at home, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has shifted focus to one of the biggest crises in the world, tensions in Ukraine. Prime Minister Boris Johnson will visit Kyiv today to hold talks with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Johnson and Zelensky will discuss the ongoing Russian hostile activity and cover the full range of strategic UK support that could be made available to the country. In a statement, Boris Johnson said that it is the right of every Ukrainian to determine how they are governed. He also said that as a friend and democratic partner, the UK will continue to uphold Ukraine's sovereignty in the face of those who seek to destroy it. Johnson urged Russia to step back and engage in dialogue to find a diplomatic resolution. Fears of an imminent Russian incursion in Ukraine have grown in recent days, despite denials from Russia, who have been massing troops along the Ukrainian border. Johnson was due to speak to Russian President Vladimir Putin on Monday. The call was cancelled, though, as the domestic crisis for the United Kingdom Prime Minister escalated with the publication of the Sue Gray report. Johnson said he would speak to Putin as soon as he can, and he urged the Russian president to choose the path of diplomacy. On Monday, Moscow had sent a letter to Washington on its views about America's response to Russia's security demands. So far, no information on the contents of Moscow's response has been divulged. The foreign secretaries of Russia and the US are also set to speak later today. US President Joe Biden said that America is ready for any scenario.
I had a productive talk last week with President Zelensky, and we continue to engage in non-stop diplomacy and to de-escalate tensions and attempt like the devil to improve security for our allies and partners and for all of Europe, for that matter. And today in the United Nations, we've laid out the full nature of Russia's threat to Ukraine's sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as the core tenets of a rule-based international order. And we continue to urge diplomacy as the best way forward. But with Russia's continuing its buildup of its forces around Ukraine, we are ready no matter what happens.
Well, earlier, both Washington and London stepped up efforts to maintain pressure on Moscow. The United States and Britain are preparing new devastating sanctions against people linked to the Kremlin. American senators say that they are almost done with finalising the deal, which will probably be put forward in the coming days. Britain says that the sanctions against Russia will be the toughest ever.
This will be the toughest sanction regime against Russia we have ever had, and it is the most radical departure in approach since leaving the European Union. Those in and around the Kremlin will have nowhere to hide. We will make sure that those who share responsibility for the Kremlin's aggressive and destabilising action will share in bearing a heavy cost. Their assets in the UK will be frozen. No UK business or individual would be able to transact with them, and should they seek to enter the UK, they would be turned back.
Well, here in the United Kingdom, the Sue Gray report is out and it's sent ripples across the country. The report has added to concerns for the embattled UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson as the chorus for his resignation after its publication grew further. Prime Minister Boris Johnson apologised to Parliament after his government was criticised for failures of leadership and judgment in allowing lockdown breaching parties at Downing Street. He promised to make changes not only to his team, but also to the way he engages with his Conservative Party. Johnson's words were met with a handful of cheers.
But, Mr. Speaker, it isn't enough to say sorry. This is a moment when we must look at ourselves in the mirror and we must learn. And while the Metropolitan Police must yet complete their investigation, and that means there are no details of specific events in Sue Gray's report, I, of course, accept Sue Gray's general findings in full. And above all, her recommendation that we must learn from these events and act now. I get it, and I will fix it. And I want to say, to the people of this country, I know what the issue is. Yes, Mr. Speaker, yes. It's whether this government can be trusted to deliver. And I say, Mr. Speaker, yes, we can be trusted.
Former British Prime Minister Theresa May said that the public had a right to expect their Prime Minister to have read COVID-19 rules. She also condemned some of the behaviour in government as being difficult to justify.
What the Gray report does show is that Number 10 Downing Street was not observing the regulations they had imposed on members of the public. So either my right honourable friend had not read the rules, or didn't understand what they meant, and others around him, or they didn't think the rules applied to Number 10. Which was it?
Britain's opposition politicians have shown little sympathy. The Labour leader Keir Starmer accused Johnson of passing on the blame to others.
It's evidence of serious and flagrant breaches of lockdown, including the party on the 20th of May 2020, which we know the Prime Minister attended, and the party on the 13th of November 2020 in the Prime Minister's flat. There can be no doubt that the Prime Minister himself is now subject to criminal investigation. The Prime Minister must keep his promise to publish Sue Gray's report in full when it is available, but it is already clear that the report discloses the most damning conclusion possible.
The leader of the Scottish National Party, Ian Blackford, was forced to leave the House of Commons after he accused Johnson of misleading Parliament and said that the Prime Minister must resign.
Well, they can laugh, but the public know. The public know this is a man they can no longer trust. He has been investigated by the police. He misled the House. He must now resign.
The 12-page Sue Gray report highlighted that there were at least 16 parties held at Downing Street when England was under lockdown restrictions. The Met Police is now investigating 12 of those 16 parties. The Prime Minister's office said that Gray would be asked to update her report once the police investigation concludes, and it would then be published. Johnson's position has been hanging by a thread following a steady drip of revelations since late last year. A Snap opinion poll of just over 1,000 British adults by Opinium found that 62% now wanted Johnson to resign, with 83% thinking he had broken lockdown rules. The saga has become the gravest threat to Johnson's premiership. Let's listen to how some Londoners have reacted to that report.
I think it's a very disappointing lack of integrity in leadership, and that's really sad for our democracy. Should he resign? I think so. But my fear is that things won't necessarily change just because he changes.
I think it's another example of how Boris Johnson has been kind of very casual about his application of the rules and the gap between standards that we expect from our elected officials and what Boris Johnson is actually able to do.
I think he's not fit to be in Prime Minister. I think he should resign. I think he's revealing things that we know about him already. So there's no surprises.
I think it's enough. No, it's not enough. Everyone obviously to just follow the rules, whatever he said on the TV, and find out now that actually they have quite a lot of parties and they enjoy their time. That's quite ridiculous. Comparing like other family lost mothers, fathers, children's with this COVID-19, and they didn't have the chance to say goodbye or to see them.
Well, we can go live now to our WION London correspondent, Giles Gibson, for the latest on this. Giles, it seems like MPs within the Conservative Party are still split over whether the Prime Minister should stay or resign. So what's the latest from those in Westminster?
Well, Laura, we know that Boris Johnson met with the 1922 committee on Monday evening in an effort to shore up his support amongst Conservative MPs. This is the committee that's made up of backbench Conservative MPs, and it's also the one that we've been watching really closely over the last several weeks to see if there are enough Conservative MPs pushing for a no-confidence vote in Boris Johnson. We're hearing different things about how that meeting went. Allies of Boris Johnson, such as Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is the leader of the House of Commons, have said that there was a positive mood in the wake of that meeting. But on the other hand, there are also several high-profile Conservative MPs now pushing for Boris Johnson to step down in the wake of Sue Gray filing her report. We've heard from Andrew Mitchell, who is a very long-serving Conservative MP. He's also a former cabinet minister. He said that Boris Johnson is running this government like a medieval court, and that he said that Boris Johnson is also damaging the Conservative Party by remaining in office. We still just keep going back to, Laura, don't we, that magic number of 54. That is the number of letters that the chair of the 1922 committee, Graham Brady, is going to have to receive in order for there to be a no-confidence vote in Boris Johnson. At this stage, it looks like the Sue Gray report has wounded Boris Johnson once again, but that we are not at the stage where enough Conservative MPs are prepared to send in their letter to trigger that no-confidence vote. Of course, we still have that Metropolitan Police investigation hanging over Boris Johnson and hanging over 10 Downing Street. And so when that wraps up, when details about that emerge, then that could be another tipping point for Conservative MPs who are on the edge about whether they still give Boris Johnson their support or not.
And Giles, of course, with all of this engulfing number 10, there's that other question, of course, as to whether this is getting in the way of other issues that actually need the Prime Minister's attention, isn't there?
Well, and that's exactly the accusation that Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition Labour Party, is making. He's saying that Boris Johnson is just so distracted by this rumbling on scandal that he's not able to do the business of government, that he's not able to focus on issues that are really a massive problem for Brits here in the middle of winter, such as rising energy costs. We're also on the foreign policy front seeing an effort from Downing Street, really this effort to try and portray Boris Johnson as rolling up his sleeves, as being the world leader and getting out onto the international stage. Of course, as you were saying, we know that Boris Johnson is heading over to Ukraine. He's going to be holding a meeting with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, to talk about those Russian troops massing on the border between Russia and Ukraine. So at this stage, it looks like with Sue Gray's report having wrapped up, that the pressure is easing off Boris Johnson ever so slightly. But of course, that Metropolitan Police investigation still rumbling on in the background, and that could raise its head at any moment.
Giles Gibson in London, thank you. Well, February the 6th will mark the Platinum Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, making her the first monarch to complete 70 years on the throne. The United Kingdom and Commonwealth countries around the world are gearing up for a year-long celebration. Here's a look back at some of the most pivotal moments since the Queen's accession to the throne.
At my coronation, I shall dedicate myself anew to your service. But I want to ask you all, whatever your religion may be, to pray for me on that day. To pray that God may give me wisdom and strength to carry out the solemn promises I shall be making, and that I may faithfully serve Him and you all the days of my life.
Through the gates of Buckingham Palace,
February 6, 1952, the day of 25-year-old Queen Elizabeth II's accession to the throne. Also a day of sorrow for the young Queen who had just lost her father, King George VI.
Inside the ancient edifice, before peers of the realm and
the head of state of the UK and 15 other Commonwealth realms was later crowned on the 2nd of June 1953, and thus began her royal journey.
Bishop lowers the 5-pound symbol of might and power, and as he places it upon the Queen's head and removes his hands, the assemblage in one voice cries, "God save the Queen."
Born on April 21st, 1926 in London, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York. Her father, King George VI, ascended the throne in 1936. In November 1947, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary married Prince Philip Mountbatten. And the royal couple have 4 children: Prince Charles, Prince Anne, Prince Andrew, Prince Edward.
The royal couple visits Melbourne, and as everywhere else, the town goes wild. The legendary
The Queen came to the throne at a time when tea was still being carefully rationed following World War II. In the years that followed, the Queen witnessed the marriage of all her children, the birth of 8 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. Royal successes, royal troubles, royally sensationalized splits, and the loss of members of the royal family. In 1977, the Queen celebrated her Silver Jubilee, an event that came as a distraction in the recession-hit 70s. And then came the Annus Horribilis, the year 1992, the year the Windsor Castle went up in flames, which was followed by an event that shook the entire world. The death of Princess Diana in a car crash in 1997. The incident that raised doubts and speculation, and the Queen's failure to respond did not help either. It was only the Queen's admiration of Diana in an address to the nation that was somewhat able to quench the public's thirst for answers.
She never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness.
Prince Philip died on the 9th of April 2021. The Queen's waning health has been a cause of concern as well, as she returned to her royal duties this year. In October last year, the Queen had to spend the night at a London hospital, which also led to her not being able to attend the annual Remembrance Sunday service on the 14th of November. The 6th of February will mark the completion of another decade of the Queen's rule, the Platinum Jubilee, with events and initiatives planned for the entire year in commemoration of this historic event. Bureau Report WION, World is One.
On the one-year anniversary of a military coup in Myanmar, the United States, Britain and Canada have hit top Myanmar justice officials with coordinated sanctions. As part of joint action with the United Kingdom and Canada, the United States Treasury Department has placed sanctions on Myanmar's Attorney General, Supreme Court Chief Justice and the Anti-Corruption Commission Chairman. The Treasury said that those individuals were closely involved in what it called the politically motivated prosecution of opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said in a statement that the US was coordinating with the UK and Canada to demonstrate the international community's strong support for the people of Burma. Blinken added that the US will promote accountability for the coup and the violence perpetrated by the regime. Blinken said that the United States will continue to press the regime to cease the violence, release all those unjustly detained and restore Burma's path to democracy. Britain also imposed similar sanctions. In a statement, British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said Myanmar's military regime has attempted to terrorise the people of Myanmar into submission. The Canadian government said that the military regime had shown no sign of reversing course on the Myanmar situation and slapped sanctions on the same three regime senior members as Washington. Meanwhile, 1 year after ousting her in a coup, the junta has levelled fresh charges against Aung San Suu Kyi. Suu Kyi has been detained since February the 1st last year. She's already been sentenced to 6 years in jail for illegally importing and owning walkie-talkies and incitement against the military and breaking COVID-19 rules. The military junta has now charged her with influencing election officials during the 2020 polls. If convicted of all charges, she could face sentences of more than 100 years in prison. The junta cancelled the results of the 2020 election in July last year. Independent monitors said the polls were largely free and fair. The junta has promised to hold her another election by August 2023 if stability in the country is restored. The takeover triggered mass protests and a crackdown on dissent, and the country is currently riven by clashes between the military and anti-coup fighters. United Nations investigators released a statement saying that more than 1,000 people may have been killed in crimes against humanity and war crimes since the coup. Ahead of the anniversary of the coup, the junta warned that holding protests could lead to charges under anti-terrorism law. But defying threats from authorities, protesters in Myanmar's second largest city, Mandalay, took to the streets with protesters carrying banners and chanting slogans calling for democracy. Well, Lake Kyiv in East Africa covers a bed of methane so toxic that it's actually called a killer lake. Each eruption of the nearby Nyiragongo volcano raises fears that that gas may escape and poison neighbouring towns and cities. But energy firm Kyiv Watt has seen it as an opportunity and is now transforming that gas into electricity that powers almost a third of Rwanda.
Lake Kivu's vast waters form the border between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And in the middle lies a power plant that creates electricity from deadly gas. Methane and carbon dioxide have accumulated over thousands of years during volcanic eruptions of Mount Nyiragongo. 2 million lives are at risk if the gas were to escape to the surface. That is why it is called the Killer Lake. Only 2 other such lakes exist in the world, both in Cameroon.
The risk with this kind of lake is that we have oversaturation of gas in the water, and that it may trigger what we call a limnic eruption, which will create waves, tsunami at surface and so on. And in the 80s in Cameroon lakes, it killed more than 1,000 people. So we don't want that it happens here.
And it is not a theoretic threat. Last year, Nyiragongo erupted again, pushing a second wave of lava deep into the earth, under the lake itself. Engineers considered a shutdown of the Kyiv Watt power plant. But the firm banks on transforming this risk into an opportunity.
So removing this gas, if it's done correctly, may help to reduce the risk of a limnic eruption. And of course, when using this gas, we can also help the country to develop by, for example, producing electricity, then we have two chances from one threat.
Kyiv provides around 30% of Rwanda's annual electricity. Ironically, the operators say it is even green energy.
Kyiv is 5 to 6 times less polluting in terms of carbon emission to a traditional or conventional peat power plant. So I would say while we are burning this gas here, even if it is a thermal plant, it's still considered as a clean source of energy.
Experts say it will take centuries to deplete the massive underwater reserves. Basically, a bottomless energy supply. But in parallel, the threat of death. Riverside residents tell of swimmers disappearing in Lake Kyiv's depths, suffocated by the gas or pulled under.
Well, that's all we have time for on today's WION Live broadcast from London. But for more global news and updates, stay tuned to WION World is One.
Many other